This station is fundraising right now, and we could use your help. This program is possible thanks to the thousands of people who support WFIU. Join them with your donation at wfiu.org/donate. You'll be in good company. Thanks.
You probably remember a few months ago when J.D. Vance said the Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, didn't belong there.
Kamala Harris allowed 20,000 Haitian migrants to get dropped into a small Ohio town of about 40,000 people, and it's completely overwhelmed the services.
There's a couple problems with that statement. I mean, lots of problems, but here's two. First, Vance was giving the impression they were in Springfield illegally. But the U.S. gave Haitians temporary protected status in 2010 after the devastating earthquake there. The first Trump administration extended that status, and so did the Biden administration. The other thing is, Vance suggested they came out of nowhere and didn't belong in Ohio. And that is what we're talking about today. This idea that the Midwest is for certain people and not others, and where that idea came from. Because, you know, people have been moving in and out of and through this region for hundreds of years. But Vance was also carrying on another tradition, the one where we deny that people here move around. Part of our whole idea of the Midwest, and Vance really leaned into this, is that it's made up of small towns with local people who are usually assumed to be white. They came from Germany or Scandinavia in the 19th century, put down roots, and never moved again. And thus they became the protagonists of the story of the Midwest. Which makes it pretty easy to say other people don't belong. Native Americans pushed around by the U.S. government in the 19th century, African Americans escaping the racial terror of the South in the 20th, or Haitians fleeing a struggling nation in the 21st. The Midwest has been shaped by the rest of the world for as long as it's been the Midwest. And I wanted to understand how that worked. So, some months ago, I decided to drive north from Bloomington, Indiana, to find out. I drove for hours. I sailed through the flatness, through waves of corn and soy. I passed a great lake, and then a grand castle rose up and receded, before I made my landing in a somewhat northern city. Before I knew it, I found myself among people who were also trying to make sense of this region we were in. So I'm in a room at a Puerto Rican-owned brew pub in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm surrounded by historians, and not just any historians, but historians of the Midwest. These are people who think about the Midwest a lot. It was the conference of the Midwestern History Association. They'd invited me to host a panel on new directions in Midwestern history. I was relieved to be around people who had questions like mine. I thought even if our region is generally considered uninspired, the province of corn, soy, steel, white people descended from Northern Europe, and not much else, there are still unanswered questions. What the Midwest is, where it is. I was surrounded by experts. And when you're an expert, you probably have to spend a lot of time dealing with other people's stereotypes about that thing you're an expert in. And so I asked the experts to start by acknowledging those preconceptions, the ideas about the Midwest that especially bugged them, so we could do our best to dispel them.
It doesn't bug me, but my accent. People calling attention to it. The O's and the A's.
The sense that it's empty, that there's nothing in the Midwest, right?
That we're all farmers, I say as someone who grew up on a farm. But that there's a lot of diverse career opportunities and things to do in the Midwest, even if farming sits at the heart of a lot of it.
The one that bugs me the most is when folks say there's nothing in the Midwest.
That it's snowy white, all white.
Then I asked the crowd. Oh. Yeah, right. Oh. Flyover country. Midwest nice. There's got to be more.
They were too polite to say anything.
That might be what wraps us up. They were too polite. But let's come back to this snowy white thing. This idea that it's all white people who are also rural and conservative. That image didn't come about naturally. It wasn't inevitable. Vance is reinforcing it, but so were writers and speakers in the 19th century. Not long after settlers started building their towns, they started writing histories of them. They weren't the kind of scholarly, analytical histories I was hearing at that conference in Grand Rapids.
It was more about distinguishing between insiders and outsiders.
This is Kristen Hoganson.
And I'm a professor of history at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign.
She wrote a book called The Heartland, An American History. We'll hear more about the idea of the Heartland itself soon enough. But for the next little bit, let's get into how those local histories told a story about who belonged in the Midwest and who didn't.
They tended to be backed by the wealthy people in any given community who would finance them and in many cases write them. And they would be the people who would write these accounts. And big surprise, the people who got the coverage of these accounts were the wealthy people, the people who literally owned the place. Typically men in different communities with their wives maybe featuring as the mothers of many children, but not really getting a lot of coverage in terms of their contributions to community life. But the point was to establish a community that was separate from other communities and all the things that would make it distinctive, to draw lines between insiders and outsiders. And the very approach was a very bounded approach. The starting point was the geographic unit, the town, the county, and then the whole goal was to fill in the lines. And the possibility that people were crossing the lines was not the goal of these histories. It was to celebrate the people who owned the place. And then there were many people who were excluded from these accounts. So the transients, like seasonal agricultural workers, people who didn't own property, people who were queer, who just didn't fit in for other reasons in the community. And a major point of these histories was to write Native Americans out of the story by saying that, well, they were here in chapter 1, but then they're gone. And to claim place for the settler colonists who were moving in, or how they referred to themselves as the pioneers, as the rightful inheritors of the place. But then what happened over time is more newcomers start coming into all these Midwestern communities, many of them immigrants, more recent immigrants. And then the local history accounts took on a double set of politics. So one set of politics was to claim place in opposition to Native Americans. But then also there was the worry, well, we might be the next people to be displaced by all these newcomers coming in. So the intent was to insist that we're different. We, the established elite, who identify as the descendants of pioneers, from Native Americans, because we're more settled. We are actually local. We own the place, in which there were false representations, claims that Native Americans didn't really have any particular sense of place, that they were inherently rovers and wanderers and people who didn't have the same kind of place attachments that people practicing European agricultural methods did. And so that was the second function of the accounts, which was to claim the Midwest for the descendants of earlier generations of pioneers in opposition to newcomers coming in. And to do so, they had to invent locality, that the pioneers, by definition, had come from someplace else. That's like the whole, meaning of what a pioneer was. And many of them had hopped around from place to place before they ended up in Midwestern areas. Some of them had parents and grandparents who had hopped around from place to place as well. And many ended up enlisting in the military. Right. So, for example, Civil War service, but also service in the Mexican War, service in wars against Native Americans in the so-called Mormon War. People took off to go prospect for gold. They would go trade down the Mississippi to New Orleans, up to Chicago, trade regionally. Sometimes they would go away for education. By the end of the 19th century, rich people are traveling widely as tourists. Just really remarkable stories of mobility. And as the settler population became denser, for people in farming communities, the question was land for their kids. And often their kids would move to Saskatchewan, to the Dakotas, to places further to the west of Illinois, like Oklahoma, to take up land. And also some accounts, far more scattered, but of looking towards Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean is also potential sites of settlement. So the idea that, the pioneers, were just local in the sense that their entire destiny would be situated in one place just didn't make any sense because of their own mobility in the course of their lives and then what happened generationally.
Right. But they were creating this sense of locality.
But they kept insisting they were local for, my point is, political purposes. And the point is that the area was more global before it became local, that they had to invent the idea of locality, which they did through old settler societies, historic organizations, and through their accounts of local history.
And what was the claim to locality then, if they were so obviously, in so many ways, not quote-unquote local?
Well, the claim to locality was that they were rooted farmers and property owners who had a deep stake in a particular community. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
And also, but I guess the larger point is just how they conceived of it, right? Like that they conceived of locality as not being relational, right? That it wasn't so much about ties to other places, which actually were quite meaningful. Many of the pioneers had family members who lived in the East Coast, who lived in Europe, and if they could afford it, they might travel back to see them. And if they couldn't, there was probably some correspondence back and forth. And so feelings of diasporic connectedness were palpable. And as I was talking about with military service and trade and so forth, their economic connections are bigger. The missionary movement was huge. So that's something I haven't even gone into. So the worlds that they're living in are not confined to their county or town or drainage district or whatever political unit you want to think about. But what the history suggests is that these units are definitive for the lives of the people who are being featured in these accounts, that they exaggerate the localness. And I think this matters when we broaden it out to thinking about the term heartland, insofar as it takes what's going on in local history writing and maps it onto the nation, the possibility that there can be a bounded area that can be conceived of as cut off from the rest of the world is really similar to the approach these histories are taking.
Northwest Indiana, also known as the region, is home to steel mills that supplied Chicago and the world. And it drew people from across the U.S. and beyond for work. East Chicago, one of the towns there, is over 50% Latino. There are many generations of Latino folks there. It feels local. And it's also not how people picture the Midwest.
I was born and raised in Gary, Indiana. And then to the region. I'm a region rat. And in many spaces, I was a minority, actually. I was the only non-Catholic, non-Latina. And so when I started reading up on Midwestern history later in life, and the way in which it was portrayed as very white, without the waves of migrants that I knew, I was in many, many quinceañeras when I was growing up. I started questioning how we as scholars are portraying it.
That's Christy Nabhan Warren, back at the Brew Pub in Grand Rapids. She's a professor of religious studies at the University of Iowa.
So when I arrived in Iowa in the fall of 2012, as an ethnographer, I was really looking for, what's the story? I've always had sort of a journalistic ethos. And it was really interesting to me that we had these meatpacking plants that were almost like mini UNs, that were employing, it's a minority white, and it's primarily African refugees, Burmese, Vietnamese. And I'm like, okay, here's a story that we're not really hearing on the news.
Even the idea of the Heartland, the original Heartland, that was in Russia. After the break, we'll hear how it ended up in the Midwest by way of the Nazis and the Cold War. Support for Interstates comes from Columbus Area Visitors Center, celebrating everywhere art and unexpected architecture in Columbus, Indiana. Tickets for guided architecture tours and more at columbus.in.us. Kristen Hoganson wrote the book on the Heartland, but she hadn't meant to write about the Midwest at all.
Yeah, I'm not a Midwestern historian by background or training. My main field is U.S. foreign relations history.
She never expected to write a book about the Heartland.
But when I moved to Illinois, to East Central Illinois, the very first day that I was in town, it was super hot and sticky. I was unpacking boxes. I turned on the radio, and I got the weather forecast for Argentina, China, and Brazil. And I thought there's something going on here that coming from the East Coast, I didn't know was happening, which was this kind of agricultural commodity market related global consciousness.
This was back when scholars were starting to pay serious attention to globalization. And that day, when Kristen turned on the radio, she realized there were geographic biases in that scholarship.
It was all about coastal areas, Atlantic world, Pacific coast, borderlands, global cities. And there was nothing in that literature about places like the rural Midwest.
Those globally connected places seemed good, wealthy, modern, advanced. The places that were seen as left behind were also seen as less global.
And so that just made me super curious about the place where I'd landed. And then eventually I wrote the book. So there you go.
She started researching the term, the Heartland. As she dug around in her historical sources,
I realized that the term wasn't used in the 19th century. So then I dug back a little bit further in time, and it's clear that Native Americans never used the term heartland, that they would have had terms for various homelands. And then early European arrivals and the Americans would have thought of what's the current day Midwest as sort of Indian country and those. And then the region became, after the formation of the United States, the Old Northwest. And then it became known as the Great West once it was more settled by European descended people. And then eventually, when the United States straddled the whole continent, then what's known as the Midwest now got that name, and Middle West and Midlands were terms that were applied to the region, but people still weren't using the word heartland. That term was invented in 1904 by a British geographer named Sir Halford Mackinder, and he coined the term in an essay about the geographical pivot of history. And he argued that whoever controlled the Eurasian landmass would control the world, that was the pivot of power globally. And he made that argument in opposition to navalist theories of power, which held that whoever controlled the oceans and the sea lanes and strategic shipping channels, like the British Empire, would be the dominant forces in the world. So it has shifted those oceanic conceptions of power to land-based conceptions of power. But the term was still only used in narrow geographic circles. It wasn't in widespread circulation in the United States until World War II. And then in that time, the word heartland kept surfacing in news reports about what was happening in Europe. And would the Nazi war machine extend its power from Central Europe and Western Europe further into Eastern Europe in the fighting in places like Ukraine that are being fought over even as I speak. So that circulated the term initially. And then in the Cold War, the term continued to be used in U.S. newspaper reportage and other publications in reference to what the Soviets were doing. And again, it was the same concern that if the Soviets came to dominate not only the Soviet Union, but Eastern and Central Europe as well, then that was a major security threat for the United States. And then it became applied to the U.S. and specifically initially to the industrial heartland, so to the industrialized area around the Great Lakes that was seen as the root of American power because of the productivity of that area. And the question was, would the U.S. heartland be able to stand up to the Eurasian heartland under the threat of Soviet domination? And so initially it was used as a term to reference the capacity for the United States to exercise power globally in a Cold War struggle that was unfolding. But in short order, it began to take on a different meaning, which was more of a soft focus meaning. It was associated with farmers of Northern European descent who were seen as repositories of some kind of bygone past, some kind of nationalist essence that was being threatened by the very heart of American power, by the multiracial workforces in urban areas in the Midwest who were actually on the assembly lines producing the steel and the manufactured goods. And in that sense, the heartland became a place that was really more of a nostalgic, agrarian, non-multicultural counterpoint to the more diverse United States as a whole and the more diverse urban parts of the heartland. And it also came to seem the place that had to be protected at all costs because it was the core essence of the country. So in that sense, the geographic location came to of being in the middle came to also imply a different way of being in the middle, of being like the heart, the beating essence or the soul of the nation. And there were security concerns that were new in the time period, that there were long-range bombers and ICBMs. And so the sense of peril was in part a sense of domestic peril, of the changing demographics of the country and rights claims by groups that hadn't been fully included in American democracy, mapped onto a sense of peril from outside threats. And it was in that context that the idea of the Heartland as a more local, insular, exceptionalist, isolationist place took hold. And if you Google the term now, the kinds of hits that are likely to come up are things like quilts and barns and livestock and fields of grain and churches and Christian schools and flags. And you're not so likely to get as many hits that are about the industrial capacity of the United States, the capacity of the United States to wield power globally, multicultural neighborhoods, indigenous homelands. Those are less likely to be the lead connotations of the term, which I think is really telling. And I think one of the things that helps me understand what was happening is a larger context of imperial denial in the United States and of thinking of the United States. And I think we've seen this recently in a lot of political rhetoric as like a vulnerable country that is threatened by the rest of the world and needs to secure its borders, needs to hunker down because it can go it alone and the rest of the world is a menace. And that defensive attitude obscures the extent to which the United States has wielded power globally and how the very standard of living that on average people in the United States enjoy, which is just a remarkable standard of living in global historical terms, depends in part on relationships with the rest of the world and the access to markets and the trade relations and the extractive success of U.S. mining companies and oil companies and so forth. And the human flows across borders have made the United States the superpower that it is today. And so I think the sense of conceiving as part of the country as separated from the rest of the world, is really being buffered by its geographic position, fits into this larger pattern of thinking of the United States as potentially separate and buffered and not thoroughly embedded from the start in global history in ways that have actually formed the United States into what it is today.
We talked at the beginning about the Haitian community in Springfield, Ohio, but they're not the biggest group of immigrants settling in the Midwest. Emiliano Aguilar, he's a history professor at Notre Dame, told us at the brew pub, and he was thumping the table to make sure we all understood. He said the biggest immigrant group in the Midwest is from Latin America.
In Indiana, it's Salvadorians. Here in Michigan, I believe it's Guatemalans. We see Mexicans in the Dakotas. These are, while new in the sense of these are recent within the past 20-year trends, these are historical trends that we've seen for quite some time.
Like since the Cold War at least.
So I think the story that I have that best illustrates this, Alberto Pedro Montes and his wife Olga were Cuban refugees post-Castro. They arrive in Miami penniless. They gave up all their possessions to leave the island. And through the Cuban Emergency Relief Center were brought, they were sponsored by a Presbyterian church out of Cleveland, Ohio, brought to Ohio. They decided to return to Miami. Alberto is offered the opportunity to manage a gas station. He gets very frustrated with this. And this is occurring the same time that states like Iowa and Indiana are requiring now foreign language courses for their high school students. They already have in these states growing ethnic Mexican communities, particularly in places like the Quad Cities between Iowa and Illinois, my corner of Northwest Indiana, but they have no one to teach Spanish. So these states devise a congressionally commended project. University of Iowa, Indiana State University are like, well, we can retrain. Alberto was a former judge in Cuba. We could retrain judges, lawyers, former state bureaucrats in Cuba to become high school Spanish teachers. He goes to U of Iowa, spends the summer of 1960 being retrained to teach Spanish for what become predominantly ethnic Mexican classes throughout the state.
The movement between the Midwest and Latin America goes back a lot longer than the Cold War. And it wasn't just in one direction. The people who headed to Mexico from the U.S., Kristen Hoganson says they weren't going there just because they felt like it.
The Kickapoos are such a fascinating nation. Historically, if you go back before Columbus, most Kickapoos were living in what is now the Detroit, Michigan, Windsor, Ontario area. And then because of the fur trade, violence started just escalating across that region, which caused Kickapoos to move more into northern Indiana, western Michigan, into Illinois, and Wisconsin. So there are communities that are fleeing the spiraling violence. And then what happens over time is they get removed by settler colonists from the Midwest and located on the far side of the Mississippi, including in reservations that exist to this day in Kansas and Oklahoma. And some Kickapoos choose to go in very constrained conditions and conditions of violence and displacement to northern Mexico, where eventually they obtain an ejido or community land grant in the northern Mexican state of Coahuila. So what we're talking about over time with the Kickapoo diaspora is movement from the ecology of the Great Lakes area, right? So think marshy, cattails, and so forth, to the desert environments of northern Mexico as a result of violence from European colonialism. So in that sense, Kickapoos over generations have been highly mobile.
Hoganson is pointing out their mobility because, remember, those 19th century local historians and writers said the reason they should get to own Midwestern land was that people who move around a lot don't have any commitment to the place. They had precedent from John Locke, the philosopher who, 200 years earlier, had said that by working the land, you make it your property. That's one way of looking at it. It makes it easy to say people who move around don't have any claim. Especially when
they're also seasonally mobile. So they would have settled villages in the Midwest where in the warmer months they would plant corn and beans and so forth. And then in the colder months, they would break into smaller groups and travel widely to hunt, which made sense to do in smaller groups in winter conditions. But they also traveled really widely for diplomacy, for trade, for curiosity. And the meaning of the word Kickapoo, according to Kickapoos, is the people who move about and walk about. So the very understanding of group identity has to do with being able to move through space. But what happened, I argue in the book, with settler colonialism is there's an effort on the part of U.S. officials to localize the Kickapoos, to force them onto reservations. And they can't leave the reservations without passes that they have to apply for, and they don't always get them. And then they're supposed to have armed guards when they leave the reservations. Some end up in the U.S. penal system, and so they're incarcerated, which was new to the Kickapoo people who didn't have incarceration as part of their system of justice. Some were locked up in military posts. A number of Kickapoo children were brought into boarding schools for Native American children, the intent being to make them less Indian, less Kickapoo. And some Kickapoo children ended up just going to day schools, but the expectation was they would sit at a desk all day long and learn geography from books instead of traveling around. Indian agents kept telling Kickapoo women to stay at home, take care of their homes, be domestic. Housekeeping, was the path to uplift. So that, for them, was a particularly gendered force of localization. There were a number of epidemics in the 19th century, and then the approach was quarantining people. So again, that's a kind of localization. And for people who'd been able to move vast distances, I just alluded to some of them, what happens is the landscape becomes really racialized and more difficult to move through. So you think about the 19th century South, there's slave patrols all over the place. So then what does that mean for indigenous people trying to move through that area? There are new kinds of dangers that hadn't existed previously. And as land becomes increasingly privatized and in the hands of European American farmers, they're stringing up barbed wire fences. They've exhausted the game. Everything becomes privatized. So then it's a challenging thing to be able to move in that way. So one of the things that seemed to me that was happening with the movement on the part of the Kickapoos who did go to Mexico was they wanted in part, my sense is a place that they could claim as their own, like a homeland in the context of land loss in the United States. But they also wanted to be able to come and go, right? To be able to move, to be kickapooed, to not be pinned down to place in ways that were happening in the United States and in the vast arid reaches of northern Mexico, where the Mexican state did not have as much of a presence. That possibility was a much more meaningful and living thing to them, right? So the point is just thinking about the politics of locality. And for the settler colonists, locality is something that is rights providing, that if you can claim it, it means people should defer to you. They should recognize your rights. You should be the community leader, the pillar of the community, and so forth. But for Native Americans, the process of being localized, of being pinned down onto a reservation, which wasn't only to keep outsiders from Indian land, it was to keep Indians in, right? You know, there was that component to reservations. That process was experienced as a form of colonial oppression, not experienced as localization as in any way liberating, right? And I just want to say one more thing is that,
sure.
You know, I'm talking about the 19th century, but the Kickapoo Nation exists today. And one more thing that really jumped out to me in doing the research is that the pioneers just assumed that, like, once they kicked people out, they were no longer part of the story, that they ceased to be Midwesterners. But there's generational trauma on the part of Kickapoo people and other Native Americans today, and memories of ancestral ties in the Midwest is still a meaningful homeland, including places from which their ancestors were forcibly removed. And we know that from Kickapoo and other Native American accounts and so forth, but also from actions, including when the grand village of the Kickapoo became a more protected area and Kickapoo people were welcome to come back to the place where their ancestors had lived. Kickapoo people traveled from Mexico, including a woman who's by her kind of 104 years old. And it was a living, meaningful place to her that she had heard about from her parents and grandparents, right? The Illinois kind of homeland, and not just, once, I guess my point is that, once people are forced out of an area, it doesn't separate all those emotive and historic ties and spiritual ties, right? If you think about like places where your ancestors' spirits are, then even people in diaspora, my point is, can still be Midwesterners.
Diaspora is one way different places are bound up with each other. Another one is the environment. When you're talking about the environment, you do have to think about specific places. But even then, you can't help but see the way things flow together. Back at the Brew Pub, Camden Bird told us about one of those topics. He's an environmental historian at Clemson University. When you're at a brew pub with, food and drink in front of you, there are topics you might be less excited to hear about. Topics like
poop. Yes, poop. It is something to take seriously. Many of you may know the Midwest is full of CAFOs, these concentrated animal feeding operations. Now, they are all over the Midwest.
And they're basically raising animals on an industrial scale. CAFOs crowd cattle or hogs together as tightly as they can survive and give them the food that will fatten them up as fast as possible.
As you can imagine, though, animals eat, animals poop. And this creates new ecological problems. I have some statistics here, and I just want to thank a researcher, Christopher Jones from Iowa, who has compiled a lot of this statistics. In 2006, the state of Iowa alone had over 3,800 CAFOs in the state of Iowa alone. Now, to give you a sense of what that output looks like at a waste level, Iowa waste produces fecal matter that, I'm sorry, I know you're eating, so I apologize for that. Fecal matter that would represent a population of 168 million people in the state of Iowa. That is drastically larger than the 3.2 million Iowans who live in that state. Now, this has real environmental implications, right? There's higher levels of nitrate in the water. This is quite harmful to human bodies, but also bad for ecologies as well.
And not just local ecologies.
Because water runs. All water eventually will run to the Mississippi River in Iowa, and that water will make its way to the Gulf of Mexico. This has created dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico as related to this nitrate. And what I would say is, a shrimp in the Gulf of Mexico does not know what a CAFO is, but it absolutely feels it. And to just sort of wrap up here, that CAFO, that history, that fecal history, yeah, you can coin that, right?
That fecal history, that feels weird to say. It might be gross to look at, but it's amazing how much it reveals.
Economic changes.
Like the move from medium-sized family farms to giant industrial ones.
There's ways you can study labor regimes.
You can look at who's working at the CAFOs. And then who's working at meatpacking plants, like the African and Burmese refugees Christy Nabhan Warren got to know. You can dig into histories of what we eat. You can learn about logistics through how meat gets shipped, how it stays cold.
And so from this small little history, right, this unpleasant dinner time talk, you have a very robust history of the environmental history of the Midwest.
And the environmental history of the Midwest is also the environmental history of the Mississippi Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. And the environmental history is also the history of immigration in the Midwest and political organizing and, well, you get the picture. So much of what's here comes from somewhere else and goes somewhere else. Like birds. Where are birds' true homes? The answer, if there is one, is surprisingly bound up with those same questions about what people belong where. After the break, our last topic. We'll hear from Kristen Hoganson about the true home debate and why birds mattered economically. Don't fly away. Support for Interstates comes from Mallard Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Mallard Grodner Attorneys, understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. On the web at lawmg.com.
So there are these histories of aviation, and there are also histories of trying to figure out what's going on in the sky. And I think that relates in large part to farming, where meteorology really matters. And it turns out that birds really mattered before synthetic pesticides. And it took a while to figure that out because there was some sense that the birds are agricultural pests. They're going to eat all your apples and cherries and destroy your crops, and birds are a menace. But the work of biologists who dissected birds and paid attention to what was in their craws revealed that there are birds that eat a lot of insects. And so farmers began to understand birds as super important, not only as sources of protein. And I should say that 100 years ago, people were eating a lot of birds that now are protected species, right? So it wasn't just geese and ducks, but all kinds of birds were consumed for food. But the realization that in addition to providing protein themselves, birds could kill insects became really important to farmers. But what happens is bird populations are going down in the 19th and into the 20th century. It's not just the passenger pigeon, that there are many other bird populations that are plummeting, which begins to cause concern. So there's some sense of birds are just moving to the west. They're like Native Americans, that the sense is there are geographies of mobility that involve westward movement, and as conservationists, we should have bird reservations in the west to protect bird species. But then there's a sense that, no, that's not exactly what's happening, that there are other migrations that are happening. And the challenge is to figure out what are those migrations. And I should backtrack a little bit by saying that there was even, if you go back to the time of Audubon, there was a theory that birds would hibernate in the winter, that they would go into muddy ponds and sleep through the winter and then emerge in the spring. So it took a while to figure out that wasn't happening. And it took a while to figure out that all the birds haven't just gone to the west. But then the question was, where did birds go? And so it was basically a big crowdsourcing project with having people report from wherever they were what kind of bird sightings they were getting, and then bit by bit putting the pieces together in terms of bird mobility. And then also the advent of scientific expeditions of field biologists going out, sponsored by the National Geographic Society, the American Ornithological Union, the Smithsonian, and so forth, to try to locate where birds went when they weren't in, say, the Midwest during the summer months. And so bit by bit, the story of migration began to be pieced together. And a lot of the scientific findings then were reported in the agricultural press, as well as in Audubon-type publications, and in local Midwestern newspapers, because, as I said, this was relevant to farmers, that they were concerned about maintaining bird populations. And what it led to was a realization that food security in the United States depended in part on what was happening elsewhere, that if bird populations were being devastated in more tropical areas in the wintertime or northern Canada in the summer, that would have implications for the U.S. And so it was really understood as not just a thing, for curious people to know where birds went, but as an economic issue, right? And in fact, the science of studying birds was known as economic ornithology. And the lead government agency for trying to figure all of this out was the Agriculture Department, because it was understood as pivotal for farming. So the point of all this is for the flown over people, they're paying attention to their point in the middle, the place where birds land and take off, and their migratory routes, or the places, that are flown over in really important ways, and that they're not cut off from the rest of the world, that their airspace is just teeming with animals on the move that are important to them.
And also, one of the ideas that came up was the sense of birds having specific locations that were really like sort of their true homes.
Oh, the true home debate. This stuff is just so crazy. Yeah. So in the context of declining bird populations, and then the follow-up questions of how to conserve birds, there came to be a lot of concern about the true homes of birds. And there were people who argued the true homes are in the South and in the Caribbean area, for example. And the evidence for that is that northern birds start flying south before they need to. As soon as they're young and fledged, then they're heading back to the tropics. Therefore, we can tell their hearts are in the tropics. And then the counter argument was, well, actually, they're birds that show up too early. They die in ice storms. They come before there are insects to eat, and they starve. And that's because they want to get home to their true home in, say, the Midwest. And the thing that clinched the argument for the true home being in places like the Midwest rather than places like Costa Rica or Panama or Jamaica was that that's where the eggs were hatched, right? And you get birthright citizenship. So if you're born in the United States, that is your true home. And it applied to birds just like it was supposed to apply to people. And then you might think, like, why does all this matter, right? Like, why do we care, if the issue is how do you protect the populations? But it was understood as how you protect the populations. Because if people in the Midwest could claim the birds as fellow citizens, then they could also claim rights over birds and then denounce people outside of the United States for killing birds and demand that they stop doing so because they were U.S. birds. And there was plenty of hunting in the United States, as I said. There's plenty of hunting in Canada. But a lot of the opprobrium came to focus on Mexico and places further to the south. And the arguments and the hunting magazines and birding magazines and so forth were like, they're taking more than their fair share. They're killing our birds. So there was this kind of proprietary sense of, it's a U.S. resource that foreigners are depleting. And the foreigners who were being blamed were people of color outside of the United States disproportionately. And one more thing that was just super interesting to me when I was reading this, that was also similar to things I was seeing in other agricultural writings, was how people were conceiving of geographies. And a unit that was a often iterated unit was North America, north of Mexico. And so birds were understood to be like robins belonging to this unit of North America, north of Mexico. And there were writings, like the U.S. military, had marched into Mexico in the 1840s. And people reported U.S. military personnel seeing robins in Mexico. This was like well known in that sense, but they were written out of that unit so that robins were understood as belonging to this fake geographic unit in which the U.S.-Mexican border was almost like a wall that extended into the sky that kept them out. But it all had to do with mapping affiliation, right? And Canada was seen as more similar to the United States. And so it was understood as a common agricultural unit, a common ornithological unit, even though on the ground or in nests or tree branches, that wasn't actually the case, right? But it was about the politics of affiliation. So let me tell you the story of Elmer Ekblom.
Great.
So he was one of these crowdsourcer people who was reporting on which birds were spotted where. And he was somebody who had grown up in East Central Illinois and was an avid birder, as were other members of his family. And I discovered him because he was keyword searching in local newspapers, and I got hits for mergansers, and the Ekblom family surfaced, and then some other bird hits, and he kept surfacing. And then I started getting hits about the Crocker Land Expedition. And I thought, what the heck is a Crocker Land Expedition? Well, it turns out it was an expedition to Northwest Greenland that departed in 1914. The explorers stayed there for 4 years, and Elmer Ekblom went as a member of that expedition. That he had completed degrees at the University of Illinois and was an expert in geology as well as ornithology. So he went and lived with Inuit people in Greenland for 4 years. And he wrote about how important birds were to their survival. So there was a hungry time before birds returned to the Arctic area in the spring. And when birds came, then they and their eggs meant the difference between life and death, that they were really important nutritionally to the Inuit people where he was staying. And he, as a birder, understood, because of these networks that I was talking about, that the birds were migrating long distances, so that they were coming to Greenland from elsewhere. So he got that conceptually. When he went back to Illinois, he was on the speaker circuit. He just really communicated to all kinds of groups his experiences in the Arctic. And then he went on and became a geographer and devoted most of his career to writing about what makes people distinctive, what separates them from everybody else, basically what makes them local. And he knew from his time in Greenland that the Inuit people, who were Danish colonial subjects, had trade goods like tea and coffee and biscuits. But in his writings about them, and we know that from other people in the expedition, in his writings about them, he only focuses on things like the birds and the other wildlife that could be obtained locally. He doesn't put them in these colonial systems of trade. And he never steps back and thinks about, like, his presence there as an Arctic explorer. And he doesn't think about what was happening in central Illinois, which was tiling and draining wetlands for agricultural purposes in ways that had huge implications for bird populations, how things like that could be affecting people millions of wing beats away who depended on birds who might have had part of their life cycle in the Midwest as well as in the tropics or further south. And he never made those connections between what he knew scientifically about the mobility of this important foodstuff and the locality of people. He kept insisting were totally local, totally distinct. And his whole point in terms of writing about them as a geographer was to make them locals and differentiate them from everybody else. So my conclusion was, like, if he didn't get that, just how challenging it was for people before all the scholarship on globalization, global connectedness, to appreciate that and to grasp it conceptually and be able to analyze it and to talk about different groups as both having community life and things that might make them distinctive and so forth, but also to acknowledge the many ways in which they have been embedded in much wider fabrics.
I like that. I feel like it gives us a little bit more compassion if we're inclined to feel critical of people for not seeing that global interconnectedness.
Yeah, it's so easy to see what's right in front of us,
yes,
and so hard to recognize what is not palpable to us, but is nonetheless super important. And I think about that, for example, with the turn to thinking about globalization, there was a lot of attention on how do you teach this, right? And a lot of the teaching was like, have your students take off their shoes, right? This is when globalization is still new, right? Like now it would be, well, of course. But there was a time, take off your shoes and see where they're made, right? And it was like, eureka, my shoes are no longer made in Massachusetts, right? Like they're coming from all over the place, from Brazil and East Asia and so forth. But then the problem with that is it doesn't teach you, like, who made your shoes? Under what conditions? Like, why are your shoes being manufactured elsewhere? What does that mean? What are the, there was a major toluene scandal in Vietnam on the part of factory workers exposed to really toxic chemicals in the process of producing shoes. And that kind of attitude, the consumerist attitude, what's like right in front of me, like maybe I'll recognize connectedness through my privileged position as a consumer, but still missing out on the fullness of it, right? Like what those forms of connection have meant to people who were not in sight, right? And I think the book, and I think what I'm trying to say about the Midwest by putting it in global history is about making some of those hidden connections visible as an example of the hidden connections that have actually made the United States what it is today.
Thank you, Kristen. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex, so much. It's been fun.
And that's our show. We'd love to hear what it made you think about. Send us an email or a voice memo through the contact tab on our website, wfiu.org/interstates, or get in touch on Facebook or Instagram. And if you like the show and you have a friend who's looking for a new show, tell them about ours. You should probably also tell them what you do while you listen. Like how you were planning to transform industrial agriculture and transportation by replacing soybeans with fields of okra because, okra seeds have up to twice as much oil, and you figured you could power a lot of cars with that, but ultimately the economics just weren't going to work out with all the fertilizer you were going to need. And upon realizing that, you got kind of depressed, and you went for a walk and turned on interstates, but you were still trying to figure out how to power cars without gas or electricity, and suddenly you had the best idea you've had yet. You could fuel them with
poop. Yes, poop.
And that's how you realized your first million is right around the corner. Congratulations. Okay, we've got your quick moment of slow radio coming up. But first, the credits. Interstates is produced and edited by me, Alex Chambers. Special thanks to our associate producer, Dom Hyab, for helping to make this episode happen. Our master of social media is Jillian Blackburn. Our intern is Carl Templeton. We get support from Eobon Binder, Natalie Ingalls, Luann Johnson, Sam Schemenauer, Peyton Whaley, Lisa Robin Young, and Kate Young. Our executive producer is Eric Bolstridge. Our theme song is by Amy Olsner and Justin Vollmer. We have additional music from the artists at Universal Production Music. Special thanks this week to Corey Halla and the entire Midwestern History Association for having me out to their conference in May. If you want to hear the whole panel we did together, it's on their website at midwesternhistory.com/podcast. All right, time for some found sound. That was, I'm pretty sure, a group of starlings on a tree. Starlings are not native to North America. Make of that what you will. I'm Alex Chambers. Thanks, as always, for listening.
Hoosier Spirits is a new documentary from WTIU and Indiana Public Media that explores Indiana's deep distilling roots and visits distilleries across the state to get a glimpse at the future of Hoosier Spirits. Learn more, check out a map of Indiana distilleries, and get the recipe for our exclusive cocktail at WTIU.org/Hoosier Spirits.